I'm Alex Burton, and this is the Business File. Our program today is about international business and the challenge it offers American firms which have entered or consider entering the arena of foreign trade. Now, I'll have to admit, it's a province of the business world I had not explored until recently. To me, foreign trade had something or other to do with Volkswagens and French perfume and Dutch chocolates. And I assumed the Bavarians, the French, and the Dutch got something in return. This, then, was international business. But in researching this program, I found the subject is infinitely more complex and more interesting, as you will discover momentarily. During this half hour, we will discuss the rhyme and the reason of international trade with some of the most respected businessmen and scholars in the field. First, however, I'd like to show you a brief documentary we've prepared that might help set the stage for what's to come.
Negation of the purposes and principles of the United Nations and of the Universal Declarations of Human Rights.
Consider the world of diplomacy. Throughout history, it has been the glue which has held the world together. From nearly all corners of the earth, representatives gather to see if they can't establish some kind of order and stability among the nations of the world. In the United Nations, the World Court, NATO, and a dozen other forums, the solutions we seek are political ones. However, there is another form of international relations which we sometimes overlook as an agency for establishing balance between nations. It just might be that world stability owes a greater debt to the business of business than it does to the business of politics. And today, as the world has grown incredibly small, trade among nations is more important for each nation than ever before. It is the key to a nation's ability to maintain or increase its economy and the quality of life of its people. In some instances, trade might well be the only key to survival. In terms of resources and goods, the world is not created equally. Some nations have oil and little else. Some have wool, others do not. Some are gifted in a certain technology or art which cannot be found elsewhere. And so each nation offers to trade what it has in abundance for what it lacks. Our first guest today is Professor Fariborz Gadar, who is Professor of International Business at George Washington University. He has authored several books on various aspects of international trade and has been a consultant to major corporations. Professor Gadar, we're pleased to be here today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
It's very nice to have you here, Alex.
Professor Gadar, could you give us some indication of the scope and importance of international trade?
Well, international business or international trade is really not a new phenomenon. It's 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Persians were involved in international trade. But the scope and the extent of it has really changed significantly in the past few decades. Presently, out of a total world output, if you wish, the world gross national product, or GNP, of about $10 trillion, 30%, or about $3 trillion, is directly related to international business and international trade. Now, of that $3 trillion, half of it is related to trade, and about half of it is related to foreign direct investment. Now, foreign investment and trade is growing a lot faster than GNP. In fact, it's growing about 50% faster. So, to put that in perspective, I'd say in the U.S. about 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 jobs is directly related to international trade and investment. And since that international aspect of business is growing faster, it's probably true that that will even increase in the future.
Well, with that many jobs related to international trade, there must be an enormous number of companies involved. Other than the obvious, to make a profit, why would an individual company want to enter the international arena? Could you provide some examples?
Companies get involved in the international arena for numerous reasons. Economic theory tells us that they're exploiting a comparative advantage. In other words, whatever it is that they're doing it more efficiently than others, and they enter the international arena to exploit that capability and make more money. In international business, Alex, we try to be more specific. Examples of that are what we call market seekers. Market seekers are companies that go after business outside of their home market. Examples are Japanese automobile manufacturers coming in the U.S. to sell their automobiles. They're coming after our markets here. Or Volkswagen building a plant in Pennsylvania. That's to, again, coming to the U.S. to get more access to our markets. There are also another motivation factor, maybe, for example, raw material seekers. Raw material seekers are firms that go after a raw material that they produce, refine, and market. For example, Texaco, an oil company, goes to Saudi Arabia because the oil is there. They have to make an investment there to extract the oil. Companies may be technology seekers. They're going where the technology exists. The French company making an investment in Silicon Valley in computer chips is in California because that's where the technology is and they want to get involved in it. Some companies are production efficiency seekers. They have to make whatever it is that they make very efficiently and inexpensively. So they have to go where they can, in fact, make that inexpensively. If it's labor intensive, they have to go where labor costs are cheapest. There are other examples as well. For example, it's a diversification strategy or a defensive strategy. Their competitor has come and made an investment next door to them. So then they don't know what their competitors may do, so they go and make an investment in their competitor's home market to make sure that the relationship is kept healthy.
Well, I've got another question or two, Dr. Gadar. If you don't mind, we'll come back to you a little later. You'll recall Dr. Gadar used the term comparative advantage, and it's one of several unfamiliar terms which will continue to crop up during our discussions. International trade has a unique language, so here's a piece to help us understand some of the terms. There is in the sea, somewhere between the Old World and the New, an island nation called Greater Leonard. The people of Greater Leonard grow enormous crops of rutabaga, and they export their surplus rutabaga extract to countries throughout the world. In all, they export approximately $1 million worth of rutabaga extract. This year, Greater Leonard's total imports will be 5,000 kangaroos, worth $2 million. The country's balance of trade is the difference between the dollar value of the imported kangaroos and the exported rutabaga extract. Since imports exceed exports, the country is said to have an unfavorable balance of trade. Next year, if Greater Leonard can increase its rutabaga extract exports and import fewer kangaroos, it might well have a favorable balance of trade. A nation's balance of trade determines its balance of payments, and balance of payments simply means the relative difference between the amount of money which flows into a country and the amount that flows out. We have seen, for instance, that Greater Leonard has a trade deficit. Its kangaroo imports are of greater relative value than its rutabaga extract exports. More money flows out of the country to pay for the kangaroos than flows in to pay for the extract. This then is called an unfavorable balance of payments. If the trade situation were reversed, if more money flowed in to pay for the rutabaga extract than flowed out to pay for the kangaroos, then Greater Leonard would have a favorable balance of payments. Greater Leonard ships a great deal of its rutabaga extract to a neighboring island nation called Buenos Sahara. The money in Greater Leonard is called begas. The currency in Buenos Sahara is peso dates. When Greater Leonard sells rutabaga extract to Buenos Sahara, the price of the goods must be converted from the currency of Buenos Sahara to that of Greater Leonard. The rate at which peso dates can be converted to begas is called the exchange rate. The exchange rate is generally dictated by market conditions, or in some cases, it can be controlled by the government. A 2-day sail from Greater Leonard is the island nation of Lesser Leonard. Lesser Leonard, as you might know, is the only country on Earth in which the jade tree grows. Since it has a monopoly on jade trees, it controls the jade tree market and is said to have an absolute advantage. Buenos Sahara, on the other hand, is noted for its marvelous date enchiladas. The knowledge of the secret recipe and the preparation skills have been handed down for generations. Buenos Sahara is said to have a comparative advantage over other nations, such as Greater and Lesser Leonard, when it comes to the date enchilada market. They are simply better equipped to produce them than other nations are. As you can see, the international business arena is a great mosaic of complex transactions. Now let's turn our attention from countries to companies. The individual companies which enter the international marketplace in order to exploit some perceived advantage. Each company entering this arena has to make some hard decisions in terms of commitment of its resources. And there are several different levels of commitment. Each represents a different approach to the business of international business. For example, a company might establish its own export department or engage an outside firm, a wholesaler or agent, to seek foreign sales. Another approach is to license a foreign manufacturer to produce and market the product. Or a company might set up its own foreign sales organization. Each approach requires a different level of commitment in terms of company resources. Now we're going to visit with John Jordan, who's the Administrative Vice President of International Operations for Core Laboratories of Dallas. Core Laboratories provides a wide range of services in the petroleum and mining industries. The company operates more than 200 field laboratories at drilling sites in approximately 26 countries. And in his 35 years with the company, Mr. Jordan has conducted business in just about every corner of the world. Mr. Jordan, thank you for having us.
Please, you could count.
Why did Core Laboratories get involved in international trade?
Well, Alex, we were pretty well drawn into international trade. We went where the markets were and where our multinational oil operating companies wanted us to go to provide the services they needed. 40% of our company's revenues, approximately, are generated outside the USA. And when you add the work done in the USA from foreign sources, that is, work that comes in from the outside, we're talking about well over half of our revenues. So international operations are extremely important to our company.
Has Core always been involved in the international arena, or is this some sort of a recent move?
We began our international operations back in 1948 in Venezuela, starting off with a franchise-type operation. The next year, 49, we established ourselves in Canada. And then we had a long spell where we didn't do anything else internationally. We had no physical presence outside of those two countries until the late 50s, at which time the oil companies started expanding their international operations, and we followed along and quickly established ourselves in Argentina, Colombia, Algeria, Libya, Australia, and France. In the following years, we expanded our operations into the Middle East, Egypt, the North Sea, and finally setting up a major base in Singapore, serving the Southeast Asia area. And today we're in China.
As you moved into these countries, what options did you utilize? What levels of involvement or commitment?
We've had a limited number of agents situations, and mainly that may be how we got started in the first place, by simply establishing an agent who had contacts and could keep us abreast of the opportunities as they came up. Eventually, if we moved management into the area, then the agency agreement was no longer needed. We've used subsidiaries, 100% subsidiaries, either branches or formed local companies that were 100% subsidiaries of the parent company.
What about partnership arrangements? Have you utilized these?
As time evolved, we found ourselves needing to accommodate local customs or local business regulations, and either injected ourselves either as a majority or a minority partner in a joint venture in some cases. We have interest in these joint ventures around the world, ranging from as little as 49%, where we're the minority partner, to up to 70% in the joint venture operations. We do export equipment. We have a manufacturing arm that exports to foreign countries, specialized laboratory equipment, mainly to governmental research groups and foreign educational institutions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jordan. I have a few other questions, so we'll be back with you in a moment. It would seem that a company once committed to international business would have smooth sailing, but no, I'm told this simply isn't so. It seems there are barriers, both natural and created, which stand in the way of trade. Now, the natural barriers might be distance or language. Created barriers come under the general umbrella of something called protectionism. Now, in the following piece, we return to Greater Leonard and Buena Sahara to see how protectionism works. One would expect that trade between Greater Leonard and Buena Sahara would be free and unrestricted. However, both employed protectionist policies, barriers which sheltered domestic industries from foreign competition. Here is why. As you will recall, the workforce at Buena Sahara was primarily employed in the production of date enchiladas. If the country were to allow free and unrestricted import of foreign date enchiladas, domestic workers might lose their customers to foreign competition. People would be thrown out of work. So a barrier was created in the form of a tariff to make it more difficult for foreign date enchilada producers to compete. Greater Leonard's rutabaga harvest became so great that a new industry developed in the country, the manufacture of barrels to hold the extract. The infant industry struggled at first because other countries had more experience in barrel manufacture and more advanced technology. To protect the fledgling industry, quotas were placed on rutabaga barrel imports in order to protect the domestic industry as it developed and grew more stable. That was not effective. Therefore, an embargo was established which allowed no rutabaga barrel imports at all. What we've just seen are examples of economic and political barriers to trade. Now I'd like to explore some of the natural barriers. We have met Dr. Gadar and John Jordan. Joining us now is Michael Jordan, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of Frito-Lay Incorporated. Mr. Jordan is also Senior Vice President of Frito-Lay's parent organization, PepsiCo Incorporated, whose food products are sold in 8 other countries and Puerto Rico. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Jordan.
My pleasure.
First, to Dr. Gadar. We are aware of the political and economic barriers to trade, but what about the more subtle barriers, cultural barriers? What falls into this category?
Alex, by culture, we mean a whole set of parameters that describe how the population behaves and acts. There are numerous cultural barriers. The most significant is probably language. But other parameters consist of religion and various customs that on the surface may not appear to be significant. For example, how you act towards business. How do you behave at a business lunch? Do you discuss business during lunch and dinner? In the U.S., it's very often we go out to business lunches. In Japan, socializing at dinner time, you don't discuss business. Again, it may not seem like a barrier, but if you don't get it right, it may influence whether you get the business or not. Other factors may be how you behave towards giving gifts. In the U.S., one normally doesn't give very significant gifts. In other cultures, you may have to do so. In the U.S., that may be perceived as a bribe. How do you cope with that? Maybe an attitudinal difference between how a person relates to the firm. How does it feel towards the future? Are they working with the firm until the end of time? Is it a lifetime commitment? Or is it basically until we find a better job? It's attitude towards time. When we have an appointment at 3, do we mean 3 o'clock or do we mean 3:30? So that sort of thing. In the U.S., when you talk to somebody, you keep a certain distance. If you keep the same distance in Latin America, or in many countries in Latin America, they feel that you don't really trust them, you don't like them, you feel uncomfortable with them. While in the U.S., if we stay as close to each other in a discussion as they do in Latin America, the American businessman may feel uncomfortable. So these cultural differences may not sound very significant, but in fact are significant barriers in international business.
John, what experiences can you share to enlarge on what Dr. Gadar has just told us?
When we're going into a new area that might represented a drastically different cultural environment, or religious environment. We try to learn about the local customs so that we don't inadvertently do something that's taboo or extremely offensive to the local people. And in certain Muslim countries, for example, you wouldn't want to pass something to someone with your left hand. You wouldn't want to show the sole of your shoe if you're sitting down talking to them like I am here. You certainly wouldn't want to serve them pork inadvertently if you're serving a buffet luncheon. You wouldn't want to put your hands on your hips. That could be offensive. Or raise your voice. I mean, these things, while they seem like maybe normal to us, could be very offensive to the locals. So one has to be very careful in that regard.
Michael Jordan, what are your observations about the cultural barriers and about American companies working within these barriers?
I think a lot of American companies and consumer goods companies, as well as industrial companies, make the mistake of arrogance, thinking that what works in the U.S. will work other parts of the world.
In other words, they may not be sensitive to the barriers. And if that's the case, then what suggestions would you make to them, assuming that their product is a good one?
You have to really make sure that you adapt and tailor your programs, to the needs of the local market. Failure to do that, to take the time to do that and to do it right, almost guarantees a failure.
That's an interesting observation. Can you give us some examples?
Well, one of our really interesting case stories in Frito-Lay involves our attempt to penetrate the Japanese market over many years, when we've tried all of our successful brands in Japan with very, very limited success. However, we were lucky in that our local manufacturing people developed a product with a unique flavor, seaweed, soy sauce, and octopus, which, while it doesn't sound appetizing to American taste, and we would never have come up with it here, turns out to be a smash. That was the key to really making our business successful in Japan, because it generated marketplace momentum, because it was unique and it was something that no one else had. On a lighter note, my first visit to the Middle East when I was working in the international business, dealing with our chap who ran the Middle East for us, who was an Egyptian. And we had finished a long day of discussion that seemed to be getting nowhere with one of our bottlers. This was a Pepsi-Cola bottler. And I expressed real frustration to Kadri. I said, Kadri, are we ever going to get anything done here? And he said, well, what you have to realize is for the Arab, who doesn't have any movies, in a place like Saudi Arabia, no movies, no dance halls, not much entertainment. Says the coffee houses and argument is their greatest source of entertainment. Therefore, he probably really doesn't want to make a deal, but he'd like to sit here for the next week and argue about it. And once you accepted that and just sort of settled down to the cultural dynamic, then you could get something done. But otherwise, I probably slit my wrist or left town before then.
Well, I can see the need to be sensitive to the existence of these barriers. Thank you, gentlemen. I've enjoyed our conversation.
It's my pleasure.
Alex, it's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Dr. Gadar, I've got one last question. When companies become involved in international business, what are some of the conflicts or disagreements that can emerge between those companies and the host country?
Again, the conflicts arise because of the various barriers. So political and economic barriers cause conflicts among the multinational company and the host country. And as time goes by, these barriers increase, especially when the local country gradually begins to see the capability within itself to do whatever it is that you're doing without your help. Now, I categorize these conflicts into three areas: conflicts relating to money, conflicts relating to linkages of your operation with the rest of their economy, and conflicts arising out of control. The money basically has to do with whether you have a tax holiday or don't have a tax holiday, what are the tariffs, whether you can repatriate your money or can't repatriate your money, that sort of consideration. With regards to economic development, host countries tend to want foreign investment to be receptive to their needs, such as maybe building a hospital, building roads, training their people. How many people do you train? How much do you invest in social services? That sort of thing. Whether you buy most of your contents locally, local content requirements, etc. These are all conflicts that arise in terms of linkages between that investment and the local economy. Now, of course, there's also conflicts arising because of control. If you are in a strategic industry, such as telecommunications, if you are a major player in a raw material industry that's strategically important, therefore the country feels insecure in having you play that role, and controls start being added and conflicts seem to be arising.
Dr. Gadar, I want to thank you for spending this time with us. It's been very informative and enjoyable.
Alex, it was nice to have you here. I enjoyed it also.
As I began to research the subject of international business, I became aware of a major misconception existing in our culture. Somehow we have always considered business and the humanities as two sides of a coin. One is always held to be totally different than the other. We even teach them in different schools. But as I explored today's subject, I found that in the world of international trade, the two subjects come together. Business and the humanities are merged into a single set of skills. To effectively conduct business on an international scale, one must not only be skilled in business techniques, but must be knowledgeable in politics, comparative religion, cultural anthropology, and world history. This is Alex Burton, and this has been the Business File.
The preceding program is part of a college credit course.
This is PBS.